At 7:06 a.m., while the street was still quiet, an official-looking envelope slid under my door. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat, dressed up as authority. The HOA had decided I was a problem, and instead of talking, they chose the law. By the time I finished reading, I understood something important: they weren't trying to fix an issue. They were trying to scare me. What they didn't know was that this decision would cost them everything within 3 days. The notice accused me of violations that didn't exist. Landscaping rules I had followed. Fees I had already paid. Deadlines I had met. At the bottom was a familiar line meant to end arguments: failure to comply may result in legal action. That sentence has power only if you don't look past it. I did. I didn't call them. I didn't argue. I didn't panic. Instead, I opened a folder I'd been quietly building for months. Emails. Certified letters. Meeting minutes. Timelines. Every interaction I'd had with the HOA was documented. Not because I planned a fight, but because patterns matter when authority overreaches. By noon, the pressure escalated. A board member knocked on my door, speaking slowly, loudly, as if confidence alone could rewrite facts. They mentioned lawyers. They mentioned enforcement. They mentioned police involvement. I thanked them, closed the door, and went back to reading the bylaws they clearly hadn't. Buried deep inside was a clause almost no one ever notices. It outlined what happens when the HOA fails to follow its own enforcement procedure. Missed responses. Improper notices. Unauthorized escalation. If those conditions were met, control didn't vanish. It transferred. That was the moment the clock started. I filed the first notice that evening, calmly and correctly. No emotion. Just compliance. The HOA ignored it. Then they escalated again, sending another threat instead of a response. That mistake mattered more than they realized. Over the next 72 hours, they would miss deadlines, contradict themselves, and expose gaps they assumed no homeowner would ever read. Each move tightened the trap they were building for themselves. They thought the law would scare me into silence. Instead, it handed me a path. And once you see that path clearly, there's no unseeing it. By the end of the third day, the balance of power would look unrecognizable. And the people who tried to intimidate me would be asking how everything slipped through their fingers so fast. They didn't realize fear only works when rules are ignored. I followed every step, every deadline, every requirement they dismissed as unimportant. While they relied on noise, I relied on precision. That difference would soon redraw ownership, authority, and control across the entire community forever. Much sooner than anyone expected at all. The morning of the second day began with silence, and silence is often more revealing than threats. No response to my filing. No acknowledgement. No correction. Just another mass email sent to residents, repeating the same accusations and quietly shifting dates and details. That inconsistency wasn't careless. It was desperate. And desperation leaves fingerprints. I printed the email and placed it beside the bylaws, comparing language line by line. The HOA had violated its own notice requirements again, this time publicly. They were supposed to pause enforcement once a formal dispute was filed. Instead, they doubled down. That single decision triggered the next provision in the clause I had circled the night before. By late morning, I submitted a second notice, attaching proof of their continued non-compliance. This one wasn't a request. It was a confirmation. Under their governing documents, failure to respond correctly within the specified window automatically suspended their enforcement authority. Suspension didn't mean delay. It meant transfer. They still didn't respond. Behind the scenes, emails started leaking. Board members arguing. A lawyer looped in too late. Someone asking if they could walk this back. But processes don't reverse just because panic arrives. They run forward until completed. That afternoon, a patrol car rolled slowly through the neighborhood. Not for me, but for visibility. It was meant to remind everyone who held power. Residents watched from porches, unsure what to think. I watched from my desk, filing the third and final document required to escalate the matter. This filing notified the county clerk of procedural failure and requested temporary administrative reassignment. It wasn't dramatic. It was routine. That's what made it dangerous for them. Routine paperwork doesn't trigger alarms until it's finalized. At 6:14 p.m., the clerk's office confirmed receipt. The acknowledgement email was short and unremarkable. But the timestamp mattered. From that moment on, the HOAS authority was officially under review. Any action they took after that point would be invalid. They didn't know it yet, but they were already operating without power. That evening, the HOA president sent a personal message asking to clear things up. I didn't reply. Communication at that stage had to be documented and public. Silence was no longer avoidance. It was strategy. Residents began messaging each other, comparing notices and dates. Patterns emerged. Stories aligned. What had once felt like isolated pressure suddenly looked systematic. Trust began shifting away from the board and toward process. The second day ended without confrontation, but the outcome was already leaning in one direction. They had tried to scare me with authority. Instead, they had stepped outside it. And once an organization loses its procedural footing, everything it stands on becomes unstable. Day 3 was coming. And with it, the point of no return. Day 3 didn't start with panic. It started with confusion, which is far more dangerous. By the time the sun rose, the HOA board no longer agreed on what authority they still had. Emails crossed paths. Instructions conflicted. One board member told residents enforcement was paused, while another insisted everything was normal. That contradiction alone violated the bylaws again. At 9:02 a.m., I received confirmation from the county clerk that the review had officially opened. That single status change altered everything. During an active review, the HOA could not issue fines, enforce rules, or represent itself as the governing authority without risking permanent reassignment. They were required to notify residents. They didn't. Instead, they tried to move faster. A contractor showed up to inspect a common area, claiming HOA authorization. I asked for written approval. He didn't have it. I informed him, calmly, that the HOA was under administrative review and that any work done without interim approval could be invalid. He made a call and left. That moment rippled through the neighborhood faster than any email ever had. By noon, residents were knocking on my door. Quietly. Carefully. They wanted to know what was happening. I didn't speculate. I showed them documents. Dates. Receipts. Filings. When people see process laid out clearly, fear dissolves into understanding. The HOA board attempted an emergency meeting that afternoon. According to their own rules, emergency meetings required notice and justification. They provided neither. I documented it and forwarded the information to the clerk's office. Every misstep they made shortened their options. At 4:37 p.m., the message they feared most arrived. The clerk's office issued a provisional reassignment of administrative authority pending final review. That meant bank access, enforcement rights, and governance responsibilities were no longer theirs. They had lost control, not through confrontation, but through accumulation of errors. The email was short, neutral, final. By the time they realized what had happened, residents had already received confirmation from the county. The HOA president tried to spin it as temporary. That word no longer mattered. Temporary authority is still authority. And it wasn't theirs. That evening, I sent one message to the community. No accusations. No celebration. Just facts. Enforcement was suspended. Records were under review. No one owed fines. No retaliation would be tolerated. Transparency would guide every next step. The response was immediate. Relief. Gratitude. Stories finally told without fear. What the HOA once controlled through intimidation was now exposed through clarity. 72 hours earlier, they believed the law was a weapon. They tried to scare me with it. Instead, it became a mirror, reflecting every shortcut they'd taken back at them. Control didn't change hands loudly. It changed hands correctly. And once that happens, there is no appeal to fear that can undo it. The morning after control shifted felt unreal, not because the neighborhood looked different, but because it finally felt quiet. No violation notices taped to doors. No threatening emails timed for maximum anxiety. Just a normal street waking up without fear hanging over it. Power had moved, and the absence of intimidation was the first sign it was real. I didn't rush to act. That was important. Authority gained too quickly can be mishandled just as badly as authority abused for years. Instead, I reviewed everything again. Financial records. Meeting minutes. Enforcement logs. What I saw confirmed what residents had been hinting at for a long time. Selective enforcement. Missed votes. Money moved without clear approval. Not dramatic crimes, but consistent negligence. At 10:15 a.m., the HOA's bank notified me that access had been updated per the clerk's provisional order. That email was heavier than any threat I had ever received. It meant responsibility. Every dollar, every decision, every mistake going forward would now be visible. The former board didn't accept this quietly. Messages started coming in, framed as cooperation but written with urgency. They wanted meetings. Calls. Private conversations. I declined all of it. Any discussion would be documented, open, and transparent. The days of backroom pressure were over. Residents began gathering informally, not to celebrate, but to understand. I explained the process carefully. What had happened? What hadn't? What this meant? I made one thing very clear. No one was losing their home. No one was gaining unfair advantage. This was about correcting governance, not flipping lives upside down. By afternoon, the HOA's attorney requested mediation. I forwarded the request to the county clerk, exactly as required. Procedure again. Always procedure. Every step I took followed the same rules they had ignored. Something unexpected happened that evening. People spoke up. Not angrily. Honestly. Stories of fines issued without explanation. Appeals ignored until penalties doubled. Rules applied to some and not others. Hearing it all together made one thing obvious. This wasn't personal. It was systemic. That realization changed the tone of everything. This wasn't revenge. It was repair. I drafted a temporary governance notice that night. Simple language. Clear timelines. Open access to records. Independent review of enforcement actions. Nothing flashy. Just fair. When I sent it, the response was overwhelming. Thank you messages. Relief. People saying they finally slept without checking their email for threats. They tried to scare me with the law. Instead, they taught an entire community what happens when rules are followed properly. Control hadn't made me powerful. It had made me careful. And that difference would decide what happened next, because restoring trust is harder than taking authority, and far more important. By the fifth day, the shock had worn off, and reality began to settle in. This wasn't a dramatic takeover anymore. It was administration. Slow, careful, and exposed to daylight. That was exactly what the HOA had avoided for years. Fear works fast. Transparency works thoroughly. My first priority was freezing harm. I issued a formal pause on all past enforcement actions until each one could be reviewed. That single decision lifted a weight residents had been carrying quietly. People came forward with files thicker than mine had ever been. Notices, emails, payment receipts, appeals that were never answered. The pattern was undeniable. Mid-morning, I met with an independent accountant recommended by the county. We didn't look for fraud. We looked for compliance. Even that limited scope revealed troubling gaps. Reserve funds were underdocumented. Vendor contracts lacked approval votes. Late fees were inconsistently applied. None of it looked intentional, but intent doesn't erase responsibility. The former board sent another message, this time apologetic in tone. They blamed burnout, confusion, and volunteer overload. I understood that pressure. But governance doesn't pause just because people are tired. Systems exist to protect communities precisely when individuals fall short. Residents asked if the board would be punished. I answered honestly. This process wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. If violations required consequences, they would come through proper channels. But my role wasn't to replace fear with fear. It was to replace it with structure. That afternoon, we held the first open record session the neighborhood had ever seen. Anyone could attend. Anyone could ask questions. Documents were projected on a screen, not hidden in folders. It felt uncomfortable at first. Accountability often does. But discomfort faded quickly into understanding. Something surprising happened during that meeting. A former board member spoke up. Not defensively. Honestly. They admitted they had never read the bylaws fully. They relied on past practice and advice that was never checked. That admission shifted the room. This wasn't a story of villains. It was a story of unchecked habit. The mood changed from anger to resolve. By evening, volunteers stepped forward to help rebuild the structure properly. Committees formed. Clear roles were discussed. For the first time, governance felt shared instead of imposed. I went home exhausted but calm. Power hadn't energized me. It had grounded me. The responsibility was heavy, but it was clean. Nothing hidden. Nothing rushed. They tried to scare me with the law. Instead, the law forced clarity on everyone involved. That clarity was doing what intimidation never could. It was fixing what fear had broken. But the hardest part was still ahead. Repairing trust isn't a filing. It's a process. And the next steps would determine whether this community truly changed, or simply replaced one system with another. That decision would be tested soon. The next test came quietly, the way real tests always do. Once the emergency passed, attention shifted from outrage to responsibility. People wanted to know what would happen when the review ended. That question mattered more than who was right or wrong. I explained the truth without drama. Control was temporary, but reform could be permanent if done correctly. That meant slowing down, documenting everything, and inviting oversight. Speed had broken the old system, so patience had to build the new one. The county scheduled a formal hearing to evaluate compliance and next steps. Until then, my role was to stabilize, not dominate. We published weekly updates, opened financial books, and recorded every meeting. Transparency felt risky, but it worked. Rumors lost oxygen when facts were easy to find. Disagreements still happened, but they stayed civil. Rules were debated openly, then written clearly. People who had never spoken at meetings raised their hands. Listening changed the tone of everything. The former board members attended quietly, some relieved, some defensive. I treated them with respect, because respect de-escalates faster than force. One afternoon, a resident asked if fear would return once authority shifted again. I answered honestly. Fear returns only when process is ignored. As long as deadlines are honored and decisions are documented, power stays accountable. That idea stuck. By the end of the week, drafts of revised bylaws circulated for comment. They were shorter, clearer, and harder to misuse. The law that once felt like a threat now felt like a guardrail. That shift mattered. It meant intimidation had lost its leverage. 3 days had flipped control, but careful days ahead would decide the future. The hearing date approached, and with it, a choice. Would we rush to declare victory, or build something durable? The answer would define whether the story ended well. I knew which path mattered. And I knew fear could not be allowed back in through impatience. The next chapter would test that resolve. It would test whether transparency could outlast urgency and whether trust could survive scrutiny. Those questions lingered as documents piled higher and calendars filled. Preparation replaced adrenaline, and that felt right. When people stopped whispering, progress accelerated. Accountability is contagious when modeled consistently. So we kept modeling it, day after day. The old playbook no longer applied. There would be no shortcuts back to control. Only careful steps forward, taken together. As the sun set on the 6th day, I felt cautious optimism. Not relief, not triumph, but readiness. Because the real work begins after the scare tactics fail. And the law, when respected, rewards patience. The hearing would show whether patience had truly taken hold. Until then, we stayed steady and documented everything. That discipline protected everyone involved. Including me too. The hearing day arrived without spectacle, which felt appropriate. No cameras. No shouting. Just a conference room, a long table, and a process designed to measure facts instead of fear. Representatives from the county sat across from us, reviewing documents we had already shared publicly. The former board members sat quietly to one side. Residents filled the back rows, not anxious this time, but attentive. I opened with a simple timeline. Dates. Filings. Missed deadlines. Contradictory notices. Nothing emotional. Nothing accusatory. Just sequence. When systems fail, sequence tells the story better than opinions ever could. The county officials asked clarifying questions. I answered directly. When they asked the former board, answers were slower, less certain. Not because anyone was dishonest, but because habit had replaced procedure for too long. One official asked a question that changed the tone. Why did intimidation become the default? The room went quiet. That wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to reflect. A former board member admitted they believed pressure kept things running smoothly. Another said they assumed homeowners wouldn't challenge decisions. Those assumptions, spoken aloud, sounded fragile. The county didn't scold. They explained. Bylaws exist to limit discretion. Deadlines exist to protect both sides. Enforcement exists to maintain order, not control. When those principles are ignored, authority erodes on its own. No one argued with that. After a short recess, the county issued its preliminary decision. The reassignment of authority would remain in place until a new governance structure was approved and implemented. Oversight would continue. Financial audits would be completed. Residents would vote on revised bylaws. It wasn't a punishment. It was a correction. Relief spread through the room, not because someone had lost, but because uncertainty had ended. The rules were clear again. Outside, neighbors talked in small groups, already planning committees and timelines. The energy felt different. Purposeful. Fear had been replaced by participation. That's a hard shift to reverse. Later that evening, I walked the neighborhood alone. Houses looked the same. Lawns were trimmed. Lights glowed in windows. But the atmosphere felt lighter. People weren't bracing for the next notice. They were preparing to build something fair. 3 days had flipped control, but this day anchored it. Not in one person, but in a process everyone could see. That mattered. Authority shared is authority stabilized. As I headed home, I realized the scare tactics hadn't just failed. They had revealed exactly why they were never sustainable. Fear demands constant reinforcement. Process doesn't. And once a community experiences that difference, it doesn't forget. One chapter remained, the quiet conclusion that decides whether lessons last. And that decision would be made not by filings, but by daily choices going forward. With the hearing behind us, the real test began in the least dramatic way possible, ordinary days. No emergencies. No threats. Just decisions that needed to be made correctly, one after another. This is where most reforms fail. Not during crisis, but during calm, when old habits try to quietly return. We set clear schedules for meetings and published agendas days in advance. Minutes were recorded and shared openly. Financial updates were posted without being requested. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, consistent actions that rebuilt confidence piece by piece. People started attending meetings not out of fear, but curiosity. That change mattered more than any vote. I watched carefully for signs of backsliding. A rushed decision. A private message asking for a favor. A suggestion to handle this quietly. Each time, the answer was the same. Put it on the agenda. Document it. Decide it publicly. Transparency only works when it's inconvenient. Especially then. One evening, a resident approached me after a meeting and said something that stayed with me. This feels slower, they said, but it feels safer. That was exactly the point. Speed had allowed intimidation to thrive. Deliberation made it impossible. The revised bylaws went through multiple drafts, shaped by feedback instead of assumptions. Enforcement rules were rewritten with clear steps and timelines. Appeals were defined, not discretionary. Every section was designed to remove the possibility of fear being used as leverage again. When residents voted to approve them, the result was overwhelming. Not because everyone agreed on every detail, but because everyone trusted the process. The former board members began participating again, this time as volunteers under the new structure. Some were hesitant, others relieved. I welcomed them equally. Accountability doesn't require exclusion. It requires clarity. People grow when systems allow them to. As the transition period neared its end, the county scheduled a final review. This time, the mood was different. Confident, but not defensive. Prepared, but not rushed. We submitted complete records, audit results, and meeting logs without being asked twice. That alone spoke volumes. Walking home that night, I thought about how quickly things had turned. 3 days to flip control. Weeks to rebuild trust. That ratio matters. Power can change fast. Stability cannot. They tried to scare me with the law. What followed proved something deeper. Law isn't a weapon. It's a framework. When followed carefully, it protects everyone, including those who once misused it. The neighborhood had changed, not because someone took over, but because people chose to stay engaged. That choice is fragile. It has to be renewed constantly. The final chapter of this story isn't about victory. It's about whether that engagement lasts. And that answer would be written not in filings or hearings, but in what happened next. The final day arrived quietly, as most lasting changes do. No sirens, no confrontations, no urgent emails demanding attention. Instead, there were routines to follow, minutes to post, and decisions to make in plain sight. The county's final review confirmed what careful process had already shown: the community was compliant, transparent, and ready to govern itself without intimidation. Authority would transition back to a restructured HOA, bound by the revised bylaws residents had approved. Oversight would remain, but fear would not. I shared the news publicly, not as a victory, but as a reminder. Control is temporary, trust is earned daily. We scheduled the handover, documented every step, and published the checklist we would follow together. People volunteered again, not because they were afraid, but because they believed their time mattered. That belief is fragile, and it requires maintenance. On the morning of the transition, I walked the block and noticed small things: open windows, greetings, laughter carrying farther than before. Those details told me more than any report. When intimidation leaves, participation fills the space. The law had not silenced anyone, it had invited them in. The former board members thanked the volunteers who stepped forward. Apologies were brief, sincere, and unnecessary to dwell on. Repair is forward-looking. Dwelling on blame only slows it. We focused on calendars, budgets, and clear lines of responsibility. Everything that could be misused before now required 2 signatures and a timestamp. Weeks later, the neighborhood felt ordinary again, and that was the success. Ordinary governance is boring, predictable, and fair. It doesn't need threats to function. It needs rules followed when no one is watching. That habit is what lasts after a scare fades. They tried to scare me with the law. 3 days later, the law had done something better: it taught us how to work together. The difference matters. Fear demands compliance, process earns consent. When consent leads, communities stabilize, conflicts shrink, and power stays accountable. If there is one takeaway, it's this: read the rules, document the steps, and choose patience over noise. Intimidation collapses under scrutiny, procedure strengthens under light. That truth doesn't belong to me. It belongs to anyone willing to follow through. The story ends quietly, as it should, with a system corrected and a community steadied. Tomorrow will bring new disagreements, and that's normal. What matters is how we handle them. Calmly. Openly. By the book. That's how authority stays legitimate, and why fear no longer runs the street. Not because someone won, but because everyone learned to do it right. Together. Every time. From now on, that choice will decide everything. And when it's tested, the answer will be clear: process over pressure, rules over threats, and trust over fear, always, everywhere, for everyone.